Hey, welcome back. So let's wrap up our exploration of Power Query by learning another way to combine separate datasets, appending them. To append datasets means to stack them, so to speak, combining their rows vertically and making the datasets taller. This is effectively the inverse of the merge operations we performed in the last video, which made datasets wider by combining their columns. While merging requires that our separate datasets each have a column that we can use to match them to the other dataset, row by row, append operations have no such constraint. They do impose a different restriction, however. The datasets we append must have the same number of columns, and these columns should also have consistent data types. In short, the datasets should be structured similarly. They should align. One very common application of append operations is combining chunks of data that have been produced by the same system and pertaining to the same process, but over different time frames. These datasets will all have the same structure, the same columns, and the same type of data in those columns, but the actual data in the rows of each dataset will be different because they pertain to different blocks of time. Say, for example, that instead of our home sale dataset being contained in a single file, it is instead provided to us on a quarterly basis, with each file containing sale data for that particular quarter. If we want all that data in one place so we can perform meaningful reporting or analytics on it, we will need to append these files together. And as with so many things, Power Query makes it easy. So here in this folder, we have our home sale dataset, the source file that we've been pulling from this entire time, but we also have 4 quarterly files where the data in our home sale dataset has been split out into 4 pieces by quarter of the year. So our goal here is going to be to combine these pieces back into a whole coherent dataset. So back to our Power Query editor. Our first step is going to be to change the connection in our home sale data query to point to the Q1 data file instead of the master home sale data file that has all the data. Now, we haven't done this before, but it's actually very straightforward to change the underlying data source of a query in Power Query. So with our home sale data query selected, on the Home tab, we'll click this Data Source Settings button. And now we see the data source for each of our 3 queries. Now we want to change the source for our home sale data query, so we'll select that and then click the Change Source button. And then, next to the file path for our current source, we'll hit the Browse button. And then, after navigating to the folder that has our Q1 home sale dataset, we'll simply select that file and then click Import. And then OK. And now if we close out of this window, our data source has been successfully updated. Now you may notice if you look at the bottom left corner of the screen that our dataset is still reflecting 161 rows. But if we click this Refresh Preview button on the Home tab, now our dataset reflects its updated source. And as you would expect, the number of rows went down because now our source file only has records from the first quarter of the year. Now at this point, we're ready to start creating queries to our additional home sale datasets. To start that process, I'll hit our New Source button, and then hover over File, and then Text CSV. And then I'll select our home sale data Q2 file and click Import, and then OK. And then I'll follow the same steps to pull in our Q3 and Q4 datasets. Okay, so now that we've created queries to all the different datasets we're going to need to combine together, we're almost ready to begin appending. But first, after going back to my home sale dataset, we're actually going to need to time travel back in the list of steps we've applied to this dataset to a point before we added or rearranged any columns within that dataset. That's because Again, with append operations, it's crucial that all the datasets we're appending to each other have the same number of columns and that those columns align by the type of data stored in them. So if we try to tack on these raw, untransformed datasets to our original dataset that has had a number of derived columns added to it and the order of columns shifted around, our append won't work. So I'll go all the way back to the changed type step, which is the last step that Power Query automatically applied when we imported the original dataset. So now we're finally ready to append these datasets together. Now to do that, as you might imagine, we'll hit the Append Queries button on the Home tab of the ribbon. And now Power Query dutifully warns us that by inserting a step before the end of our list of applied steps, we might potentially break something downstream. But we've already thought this through, so we should be good to go. So I'll go ahead and click Insert. And now we have our typical user-friendly Power Query dialog box. We see first that we have the option to append either 2 tables or 3 or more tables. Now obviously we're appending 3 tables into our original, so we'll choose 3 or more. And then we're given a list of tables available to append on the left, and then the list of tables we're actually appending on the right. And because we had our home sale dataset selected, that's been added to our list of tables to append by default. So all we have to do is select our home sale data Q2 through Q4 files on the left, and then add them to the list of tables to append on the right. Now we simply do this by clicking to select an individual table on the left, and then hitting the Add button here to add it to the list of tables to append. But we don't even need to perform this process on each individual file. If you just hold down your Control button, and then click each one to select, we can now add them all as a group. So we'll click Add, and now we've got all 4 of the files we're trying to append listed on the right. So we should be good to click OK. And if you look at our row count in the bottom left, you'll see that we now have our original number of rows before we added any filtering transformations later in the process. We see this original unfiltered number of rows because we inserted this step in our list of applied steps before those subsequent transformations. But that's necessary because we want all of these subsequent transformations applied to our appended unified data set. So if I scroll down in my list of applied steps to the very end and then select the last one, we're back to our 161 filtered rows, and then if we scroll to the right, it looks like all of our derived columns are still intact. So I think we can conclude that our append operation was a success. All right, with that, we have wrapped up our little survey of Power Query. Now there's certainly a lot more you can do with it, especially if you're willing to learn the M programming language that underpins Power Query transformations. But what you know right now will be more than enough to handle the vast majority of extract, transform, and load data operations that come your way. And that's why we're now going to pivot, for lack of a better word, into the world of Excel's data model, an incredibly powerful feature in Microsoft Excel that allows us to summarize and visualize massive data sets of potentially hundreds of millions of rows spread out across multiple data sets using nothing more exotic than good old-fashioned pivot tables. That's all coming up next. I'll see you then.